Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. This episode is all about pressure. It's about thinking about how do we manage the pressure that comes at us in this process. Pressure is something we want to manage well, because if we don't, it can completely throw us off track. And so we've got to be masters of pressure and know how to apply pressure, but also know how to deal with pressure. And to help us think through this, I am honored to welcome our guest, the warrior maker, Chris Harris. For 25 years, Chris Harris trained the special forces in the U.S. military on how to operate under pressure. He's a member of the U.S. Martial Arts Hall of Fame, and he has spent the last couple of decades helping business leaders and other executives think about how to manage emotional control and make decisive decisions when the stakes are very, very high. Let's jump into this conversation with the warrior maker, Chris Harris. So Chris, give us a little bit of your background and talk to us how you kind of got into this space where you help people think about how to perform when the pressure is on.
Yeah, so I was raised on the streets in Dayton, Ohio. Mother was a heroin addict, but by the time I was 10 years old, she was in prison. Lived with a lot of different foster families, and then on my 18th birthday, I joined the military. That was my gift to myself. Was how can I get out of Dayton, Ohio, and get away from all the poverty and drugs and all of those things. So on my 18th birthday, I was still in Ohio. Still in high school, and I enlisted into the military, and off I went to boot camp. And I didn't know that I was going to spend the next 25 years of my life as a private contractor, but that's what happened. So for 25 years, I served for 4 years, and then I got out, and then for 25 years, I was a private contractor training Tier 1 and Tier 2 elite special forces. And I taught barehanded combat, weapons of opportunity, manipulating the central nervous system, things like that. But you know, when you think about mindset, when you think about pressure, when you think about negotiating when the stakes are high, you know, Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, I mean, they are the epitome of mindset and performing at a high level under intense pressure. So I learned more from them than I taught them. Well, you know, what I taught was a very specific skill set, but I learned just a tremendous amount regarding about how they operate, you know, and how they function into what they call relative superiority. So, you know, when they negotiate from a position of relative superiority, which is completely different than attitude or belief or hope or mindset. It's something that's in a whole different level. And so when I aged out of being able to work with these, young operators, because, you know, they're all about 28, 29 years old, 8% body fat. And I eventually aged out, and I had to find something else to do. So I pivoted into the sales world, high dollar, high ticket, technical sales, B2B. And I realized very quickly, and I was in my 40s, and I'm starting all over from scratch in a very competitive landscape, you know, to where some of the pieces of equipment I sold were, you know, millions of dollars per piece of equipment. So very competitive. And I learned very quickly that the mindset piece that I had been teaching and learning for 25 years was my greatest competitive advantage. And so I started applying all of that, and very quickly, I rose to the top of the sales ranks worldwide in selling what I sold. But but I was taking something they were using for combat and survival and winning, and I basically just reapplied it to a different battlefield, which was the corporate B2B sales.
All right. Well, I'm really excited about getting into what were those things that translated and crossed over. Before we go, though, let's talk a little bit about relative superiority. You've got me curious as to what that is and what that looks like.
Yeah, that was a term. It was a phrase that was coined by Admiral McRaven And I believe it was in the 90s. But Admiral McRaven, at the time, I think he was a captain in the Navy, but he was going to naval postgraduate to get his MBA. The military was putting him through the program to get his MBA. They saw leadership qualities in him, and he wrote a paper for his MBA at Naval Postgraduate. And I think it's in Monterey or somewhere like that. But he wrote a paper. Now, who would have known that he was eventually going to become, the 4-star admiral who was over, Special Operations Command, and become a Navy SEAL. And eventually he became what they call the bullfrog. The bullfrog is the highest ranking, or not highest ranking, the basically whoever is in the Navy SEALs that's been in the Navy SEALs the absolute longest. That's the bullfrog. So he was the bullfrog. He eventually became SOCOM, 4-star admiral commander. He's the one who wrote the book, Make Your Bed. Sure. But he's just a phenomenal individual. But he wrote this paper, which eventually became his best-selling book that he wrote on Spec Ops. And again, in that book, he talks about relative superiority. And he talked about what makes a 6-man team so powerful. And, how can you basically drop these 6 men off in enemy territory at 3 a.m., halo jumping in the still of the night, and the enemy could be outnumber those 6 by, there could be 300 enemy ground forces on the ground. And they know that these 6 Navy SEALs are coming, and they're shaking in their boots. How do you achieve that? And he said, well, you achieve that not through your mindset. This is how you really win. You achieve it through messing with their mindset. So if I was a UFC fighter and I knew I had this really big, pro fight on Saturday night, and it was worth millions of dollars to the winner, and I would want to develop the mindset that when I step into that octagon or that cage on Saturday night against my opponent, a good mindset would be, I'm going to win. Okay. A great mindset would be, there's no way anyone's going to beat me. All right. So I'm going to win's a good mindset. There's no way somebody is going to beat me is an even better mindset. But relative superiority is achieved when the person you're fighting says, oh shit, there's no way I can win. I just found out who I'm fighting on Saturday night, and I know there's no way I'm beating that guy. And when that happens, when your enemy knows they can't beat you in negotiations or barehanded combat or in a winner-take-all sales competition, that's when you've achieved relative superiority. And if you read his case studies, if you read the stuff he wrote in his book, there's only one way you can really achieve, relative superiority, and that is it's a team effort, and it's through shared purpose. So it may be you who's sitting at the conference table negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal, but you have to have shared purpose with everyone on your team in order for the other guy across from you at that board table to know that there's no way we're going to win. So it all starts and ends with shared purpose. It is not an individual sport.
And so what are some of the things that you've identified that can help achieve that shared purpose that Admiral McRaven talks about?
Well, first of all, you all have to be aligned in one of the most important fundamentals of mindset, which is that there's a space that lives, it's not in our conscious mind. It lives outside of our conscious mind in the subconscious. And there's a space that's somewhere between stimulus and response. And if you think about it, from the time you wake up and the alarm clock goes off or your phone starts buzzing, it's time to get out of bed, that's a stimulus. And then you now have to choose either your response or your reaction to that stimulus. And when we master mindset, what we're really saying is that we've mastered the space or the distance that happens hundreds of times a day between stimuli and response. We master that space. So when you are sitting at a table and you're negotiating better terms or better price or whatever they say to you is a stimulus, and whatever you respond with is your response, and you want to get it right. And you want to achieve and maintain relative superiority. The first time you give the wrong response or you react emotionally, for example, you've now lost the high ground and you've lost relative superiority. So if you want to have it, one, you have to have shared purpose with everyone standing behind you. And number two, you've got to master how you respond to the stimulus or stimuli that they're throwing your way constantly.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. So, funny story about Admiral McRaven. In my book, Negotiation Made Simple, which is just behind me here, I tell a story about Admiral McRaven and a story he used to tell about taking the buds, right, out to an island off of the coast of San Diego, and they would drop them in the middle of the water, and they would then have to swim to the island. And before they did that, though, they would give them a briefing, and in that briefing, they would just talk about the sharks and the great white shark nurseries that existed out there in those waters that they're going to get dropped into in the middle of the night. And then they coach them on how to fight off a shark should a shark attack one of them. And apparently there's never been a shark attack, but it's just the mental game of, can you overcome the fear of these sharks? So I put that story in my book because I thought it was just a really interesting story about competitive negotiation and how you have to overcome, it's probably similar to some mindset things. But what I've learned is, when you write a book, you also have to then read the audio version of the book. And so I spent probably 3 hours of my life trying to get through those 2 or 3 pages, saying the words Admiral McRaven clearly enough for the audio engineer to be like, all right, let's go on. I don't want to stop you. But I would just slur through those words, and it took forever. And so I said, as much as I love Admiral McRaven, I'm never including him in another book just because I cannot say his name clearly.
That's great.
So, all right, let's jump into, you've kind of raised this whole idea of mindset, which I love. And you've given us kind of a sense in terms of Admiral McRaven's perspective of it. But just talk us through it as you think about coaching negotiators. Give us a sense of the mindset that you would encourage them to have as they manage this very consequential process.
Well, I think you have to start every negotiation with a very clear understanding of what your desired outcome is. And then you also have to have a very clear understanding. And you may not start off with this, but you need to start off with knowing I need to get this very quickly. And that is what is the desired outcome of the person sitting across from me. So, that person sitting across from you is going to be motivated by a lot of different things, but your first order of business is to find out what the primary driver is. And that would be, let's say their primary driver is a fear of loss. Okay. They have a problem that they have to solve. Okay, well, you don't negotiate to a fear of loss driver the same way you would if their primary objective is they want to gain an advantage. All right, they're not trying to solve a problem; they're trying to gain an advantage, whether it be money or property or rights. And so that would be a desire for gain. And if you're sitting here negotiating to a desire for gain need or desired outcome, when the person really has a fear of loss or problem to solve mindset, then you're already way behind in like before the first word's even been spoken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that loss aversion, it's fascinating. I'm sure you've seen the research. I've seen it where loss aversion is actually a much larger motivator than
it
gain.
Is.
And so trying to understand what is it that people fear that they can lose in the process and how to then put that on the table in such a way that you can be influential, that is a really significant thing. But you're right. That's a game that most people don't even know is being played because it's happening at almost a subconscious level.
It most certainly is a subconscious level. And that means that when you're negotiating, the only way you're going to get into their subconscious level, which is where that stuff is really residing, whether they admit it or acknowledge it or are aware of it is not the point. But that's where it's at. It's in the subconscious. And that means that if you're going to get down to that, you're going to have to get past what's called their critical faculty. Their critical faculty is, imagine this 7-foot-tall, 400-pound, solid muscle bouncer who's standing on the other side of the red velvet rope. And he's not going to let you, we'll call him Critical Carl. He's not letting you or what you have to say get into the subconscious level of that person because he sees anything new and unfamiliar as a threat. So that means if you're negotiating with them and their analytical mind, but you're negotiating to something that resides in their subconscious. So let's just say it's a fear of loss. That means they're protecting something. And when people protect something, they can be fierce and they can be irrational. So you have to understand that I'm not just going into your subconscious where this stuff is, really coming from. I got to get past your mental firewall first, critical Carl, that critical faculty who doesn't want anything to get on the other side of those red velvet ropes unless it deems it safe.
And so how do you do that?
Well, you have to understand what it wants and what it sees as safe. But the first thing is repetition, and the second thing is feeling and emotion. So in the case of negotiating, we would have to come across very authentic, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't fake authenticity, hence the word authentic. But we have to touch on their feelings and emotions, and we have to be repetitive. So, and we also have to create strong visuals in our communication. So, if I were going to talk to you about, hey, I notice on the bookshelf behind you, you got a plant, looks like a small fern, and it looks like it's in a white container and it's right above. Okay, that's visualization. So we need visualization with a little bit of emotion, a little bit of feeling, which comes through just being authentic, and then repetition. And that is what the critical faculty responds to, and then finally steps aside and lets you through.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things along those lines that I do sometimes is just try to change the environment and to change kind of the tone of the conversation by changing the environment. And sometimes that means like, hey, listen, why don't we just go have a cup of coffee and talk about this some more? And, you just get into a completely different environment where people can react emotionally a bit differently. And then many times in those conversations, kind of like you talked about with the fern, you talk about some other things to kind of build a level of rapport, build a little bit of trust so that people are willing to be a little bit more vulnerable in terms of letting those guards down just a little bit so you can get the information you need to truly understand what you have to solve for.
Yeah, and you mentioned trust, because trust is definitely the door in which we have to walk through. And trust is established through what's called PDF. And there's no faster way to establish trust. So if you go back and you look at some of the three-letter agencies like the CIA or the FBI, when they teach for operators, when they teach them how to very quickly establish the trust of another person, either because there's something we need from them, or we need them to be an ally or an asset, whatever it is. They all teach from the same manual, and that is PDF, kind of like if you take a Word document and you save it to a PDF. It's that acronym. But it's proximity, it's duration, and it's frequency. That is the fastest way to establish baseline trust with an absolute stranger or someone who you've known for years, but you don't have a real relationship with. So proximity, frequency, duration. So when we're speaking to critical Carl, we have to make sure that we're incorporating this. So let's talk about proximity. Well, proximity is not going to be achieved through an email. It's just not going to be. You've lost tone. You've lost volume. You've lost inflection in the voice. You've lost all of these things. So if you think that you're going to negotiate effectively through an email, just know you've already lost the trust factor because there's no proximity. But the moment you can get them on a call, and now you've got inflection and tone and volume, because look, 90% of communication is nonverbal. So just getting them onto a voice call versus email, now you at least get proximity in the picture, and that's an absolute must for trust. If you can get them on a video call to where the camera's on, and now you're watching everything from eyebrows, are they going up or going down, which, that's friend or foe. So by getting on a video call with their camera on, now we really flip the switch on the proximity piece.
Great stuff. So one of the things I've noticed about some of the folks that, I'm negotiating with is in the context in which I negotiate, things are getting tougher. The deals are getting harder to achieve. And as a result, I've noticed that people are getting tired. they're losing a little bit of their resiliency. And so talk to me a little bit about kind of mental resilience. I know you've written about this and you've talked about it, but give me a sense in terms of how do you build kind of the mental resilience in someone as they are negotiating kind of high stakes negotiations?
Well, let's talk about resiliency for a minute, because it's really, we could really use a better word, because
Okay.
when you talk about resiliency, all you're really talking about is someone being very firm in their why. Okay. You cannot have resiliency through consistent adversity unless you are strong about why you're doing it in the first place, why you started on this negotiating, this journey, this business contract. What made you start in the first place? You have to be very strong on your why. You got to be able to articulate it if you had to, 10 times a day if you had to. And so what happens is resiliency and your why are symbiotic. They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. When you talk about people setting this incredible goal, I mean, just really, whether it be physical fitness or it's finances, or I'm going to build a business from scratch or whatever it is, they start off with a really strong why. But if you look at wherever, between here and reaching the summit of that goal, where they actually hit the plateau, stopped, gave up, turned around and started going back down the mountain, you can almost always pinpoint that to where they forgot their why. Look, resiliency has to have something to sink its teeth into when the stuff gets hard. And what does it sink its teeth into? So you need to step back and say, hold on, I'm starting to get burnt out. I'm getting worn out. I'm tired. I'm done with this. I'm ready to just throw in the towel and say, fine, we'll give you what you're asking for. I just want this off my plate. That's someone who really needs to go back and revisit. I mean, really revisit what made me compelled to say yes to this assignment in the first place.
Sure. That's great advice. The next thing I see is, fear. Folks making decisions based on fear as opposed to strategy. And so talk to me about, what the role is in all the dynamics that you've worked in. Fear is also present. Sometimes it's, fear of your own life. It could be fear of your business and its success, but fear plays a role. How do you train people to overcome fear and to use it as something that is positive as opposed to something that causes them to make poor decisions?
Well, the very first thing they have to do is they have to practice what's called metacognition. And metacognition is basically, in the simplest terms, it's basically mastering the ability of thinking about what you're thinking. All right. So it goes way beyond like self-awareness. Metacognition, thinking about what you're thinking. And so once you really kind of get into this thinking about what you're thinking, this metacognition loop, then what happens is you the first most important step to overcoming fear is identification and classification. So you have to say, okay, first of all, I am aware that there's a fear in me. All right. Now I have to identify and classify it very quickly before I can deal with it. And that is it a rational fear or an irrational fear? The two are completely different. We know what rational fears are. Hey, a woman has parked their car by herself, going in to meet her friends in the nightclub, or whatever for drinks. And all of a sudden she's walking, down the sidewalk and it's 11 p.m. and everything in her says, turn around and go back to your car right now. I don't know why, just go. That's intuition. That's a rational fear. I'm by myself. I'm in an unknown neighborhood. It's late. Okay, that's rational. Rational fear is designed to protect us. It is a counselor. Irrational fear is a jailer. Okay, so here's how I would evaluate fear very quickly to determine if it was rational or irrational. It's irrational if, one, it has a very low probability of happening. Okay, that makes it irrational. So if you're afraid to fly on a commercial airline because you're afraid the plane is going to plummet to the ground and you're going to die, well, statistically, that is an irrational fear because the probability of that happening are very low. But if you're afraid to check your luggage because you don't want them to lose it, all right, that's a rational fear because statistically that happens a lot. So if it has a low probability of happening, that makes it an irrational fear. And then another thing is fear is designed to motivate you to take action to change the potential outcome. So if you are afraid and it's not motivating you to take action to change that outcome that you're afraid of, then it's irrational. It's irrational because it's not serving you. It's not useful. So the first thing you do is you get really good at with metacognition. Wait a minute. Wait, I acknowledge the fact that I'm afraid. Okay. That's thinking about what you're thinking. Now I'm going to run this through it. Is there a high probability of this happening? No, a very low probability of this happening. All right. Am I doing anything? Am I taking any kind of action to change the outcome of what I'm afraid of? No, I'm not. Then it's irrational all the way across the board. Now, if you say, yes, this is a rational fear, absolutely, it does have a high probability of happening. Okay, then what steps am I going to take to change the outcome? And now all of a sudden, fear is serving you. I mean, you have thrown a saddle on its back and you've got the reins in one hand and a whip in the other, and you're riding that damn thing like Seabiscuit. And now you're monetizing fear.
Good deal. And so just to close the loop on this, so what do you do if you have an irrational fear that's just stuck in your head? What do you do about that in terms of how to move on, how to get past it, how to make it go away?
Well, what I do is I'll give you an example. I've struggled with claustrophobia my whole life. Well, claustrophobia is an irrational fear, and I fly a lot for a living. I have a lot of miles. I spend a lot of time on in the air, internationally and domestic. But I'm claustrophobic. So when they close that cabin door, I mean, it's game on. And so one of the things that I do is I say, all right, Chris, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen here? And if that is what happens, am I okay with it? Well, the worst thing that could absolutely happen is I could suffocate to death sitting in seat 1A and I could be dead before we land. Okay, you got to be real, right? Like, what am I really afraid of here? I'm afraid of suffocating to death on this airplane before we land. Okay, is that realistic? No, I don't think it is. I don't think anyone's ever suffocated from sitting in first class on American Airlines. So you walk yourself through it, but you start with what is the worst that could happen, and then you reverse engineer it to what's logically probably or likely going to happen.
Good deal. So the other thing in negotiation that people have to deal with that they're constantly raising with me in terms of wanting counsel on is the other side, and the other side that's trying to rattle them, whether that be through threats, whether that be through kind of take it or leave it negotiation, whether it be through leverage and how they've got leverage on them and their willingness to kind of use it. How do you coach people to kind of stay calm and in control when the other side is trying to actively rattle them?
Well, I think you got to be very clear about your desired outcome before you sit down and have that conversation. And every time somebody, starts using those kind of tactics, manipulation, fear of loss, threats, whatever they are, you have to, this kind of goes back to what is resilience? Well, resilience is never forgetting your why. Well, when you sit down in negotiations, what is my desired outcome? What are my non-negotiables? And nowhere in there is my pride, my feelings, my emotions. Like, that's not on the table. That has nothing to do with any of this. So anytime they start hitting you with the things that are touching on the emotional part of you, fear of loss or threats or any of these things, right? We're going to make your life miserable. We'll take everything you own. Just keep coming back to what is my desired outcome, and is me letting that stuff ruminate rent-free, even for 30 seconds, is me ruminating on that for 30 seconds. Is that helping me? But then also another very important question you have to ask is any of that in my control? Because I'm telling you, if you're sitting down negotiating with someone sitting across from you, every moment that you spend thinking about something that's outside of your control, you are absolutely weakening your power to win.
And so when you have someone who is actively trying to do that, You've given us some good ideas in terms of what to do in between our ears. What do you do with the person that's trying to rattle you? You have any ideas there?
Yeah, I mean, there's some one-line statements that basically, that kind of get you kind of 5, 6, 7 one-line statements that whenever they start using those tactics that you could throw out. And basically what you're doing is you're letting them know that it did not have the effect that you intended, and it's not going to have the intent that you the effect that you intended. And what happens is they'll eventually stop using those tactics. So, somebody says, look, I'm gonna sue you for everything you have, and you're gonna spend the next 2 years in court with me. I would simply look at them and say, thanks for sharing. I mean, you disarm it like a bomb.
Yeah.
The moment you say, don't threaten me, well, guess what? You've engaged. Never engage with that stuff. Just disarm it. Imagine that they just threw a live grenade right in front of you, and you got to decide, what am I going to do with the live grenade? Well, you're going to grab it and throw it out the window as quickly as possible, and let's get back on point. So what can you say that would disarm that? That's good to know. Good comms, message received. Thank you. What's next?
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, let's flip the script here a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about pressure that's coming at us and how to deal with pressure that's coming at us. But there's also things that we're doing to try to put pressure on the other side and to try to gain an advantage and to try to be influential. How do you read when somebody is perhaps cracking under pressure, or the pressure is beginning to get to them, or the pressure is working in terms of moving them? How is it that you're kind of looking for those signals in the person that you're negotiating with?
Well, understand that the difference between worry, pressure, anxiety, and stress. Okay. If you take a look at those 4 words, they all have a lot in common, but worry, stress, pressure, anxiety. Okay. But out of those, pressure is pretty easy to identify because it has physical tails. So let's talk about what pressure means as far as, like, from my standpoint, if I'm teaching, pressure and stress and worry and all these things, right? From my standpoint, pressure is usually something that has a couple of things that are required to produce it. And one is something really big is expected of me. Okay. Either by myself or by someone else. So either I expect, like, let's just say you're a VP of sales for a company and you've got a very big quota by the end of the quarter, and you're coming up to the end of the quarter and you're not even going to come close to hitting that quota. All right. So pressure would be something is expected of me, or something is expected of the team that I'm leading, which means it's really expected of me. So one, it means something is expected of you. And then the second requirement for pressure means, and there is a non-negotiable deadline. All right. So when you put something's expected of you and there is a non-negotiable deadline, that's what creates pressure. If you aren't experiencing pressure, your goals are way too small. All right. I'm telling you, the version of yourself right now that you are, we'll call that your current position in life. The version that you are aiming to become, we'll call that the future trajectory, the best version of you, right? So somewhere between current position, who you are today, and future trajectory, the person that you want to become, John, there's no way that I'm aware that you can get there to future trajectory, John, without passing through a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And if you can get there without passing through a lot of pressure, meaning something big is expected of you and there are deadlines attached to it, then you're probably not dreaming big enough. But one of the things you do is, if you want to see, is it just a tactic or are they really under pressure now? Is pressure usually gives a lot of signals that are physical. All right. So, tapping on the desk, playing with their ink pen, sweating, constantly, looking away, whatever. But there's just a lot of tales. Like, look, most of us can tell when the person sitting across from us becomes uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And if they're uncomfortable, they're probably the one that's feeling more pressure than you are.
Yeah. So we may have to do another episode on this, but I do want to get your insights on sales negotiation. You do a lot of work in the sales area. You work with thousands and thousands of salespeople. Talk to us a little bit about what's the best advice you have for somebody that is negotiating in the context of sales.
Well, the very first thing you have to do is you have to figure out what their persona is. So if it's in sales, then you're talking to let's say a buyer, right? And if you're talking to a buyer, your very first objective is to figure out what is their buying persona, because every buyer has a different persona. So for example, are they a number cruncher? Okay. Are they an early adopter, meaning they're a risk taker? They don't mind being the first one through the wall because they understand that the reward for being the first one through the wall could be potentially, huge. Or are they a status quoer? Status quoers mean, hey, we've been doing it this way forever. We've never done it the way you're proposing. Your way makes me uncomfortable. So you cannot negotiate to a number cruncher and a status quoer and an early adopter the same way. So it's kind of like when I'm talking to my wife. Me and my wife, we've been married 30 years. We're best friends, but we've like any couple that's been married 30 years, you have to learn how to communicate, right? You have to. So anytime my wife starts to tell me a story about her day or about something with her and a family member or a relationship at work, whatever, the very first thing I do is I try to figure out which of the three H's is she speaking from? Because when my wife tells me a story, there's only one H that she's really trying to speak from to me, and that is she wants to be helped. She wants my advice. All right. She wants to be heard. She wants me to just shut up, sit there and listen. All right. Don't say a thing, just listen. Or she wants to be hugged. All right. So does my wife right now in this current story she's telling me, does she want to be helped? Does she want to be heard? Or does she want to be hugged? Now, if I misread that and she wants to be hugged, but all of a sudden I come in with advice and start helping her, how's that going to end?
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge.
It's the same way with negotiations. It's the same way in sales. The very first objective is to metaphorically say, which one of the three H's are they speaking to me from right now? And when you figure that out, and then you only speak to that one, early adopter, number cruncher, right? Status quo, and you speak to that, look, the hard part's over now.
Yeah, what you just described, I'm reading a book right now that's real popular called Theo of Golden. I don't know if you're familiar with it, about this guy that shows up in this small town and he goes into this coffee shop where there's all these portraits all over the coffee shop. And he starts buying the portraits from the coffee shop owner that was done by this local artist. And he goes and finds the people who are the subject of the portrait. And he gives the portrait to the person. And then in the context of that, he just listens to their story. And it's amazing how these are total strangers that are having this interaction around these portraits. And yet, despite the fact that they don't know each other, they've never met each other, that everyone's a little nervous to kind of meet, these people just open up and begin to tell their stories. And the lesson from the book is what you just described. And that is not everyone comes to you because they want your advice. Many people come to you because they just want to be seen, and they just want to be heard. And that is the most influence sometimes that you can have on someone, is just your presence in that. And so I think that's really, really kind of sage advice. So speaking about a book, I'm really curious as we kind of wrap this thing up, what's a book or what's a practice or a person that really has kind of shaped you the most? And what did you learn from them that was so valuable?
I think, Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, probably had the biggest impact on me. And in that book, I mean, that's just relationships 101. And I think what I really gathered from that book, there were so many takeaways, but the first one was, look, there's no such thing as constructive criticism. There's just criticism. That's all there is. And, and nothing good is ever going to come out of it. Nothing. Look, you can give someone feedback. That's different. Okay. You can give someone advice. That's different. But criticism, never a good idea. And if when people come to me, like couples that are, have only been married a year or two or three, and they say, hey, what's your wife and, what's you and your wife's secret to, a 30-year happy marriage? I always say the same answer. My wife and I have made a deal, like from the altar, right? 30 years ago, we made a deal. Under no circumstances will we ever criticize the other. But I can tell you that I learned that from that book. Yeah. And then the other thing was, there's no sound sweeter to anyone than hearing the sound of their own name, so just really going out of your way to, find that name tag and call them, hey, Carla, how are you today, Carla? And it's a lot of little nuggets like that, but the book it has 100 of them, and every one of them in themselves are worth the price of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I would encourage people to not read that book, but to literally read it every year. Like if there's a book, maybe other than the Bible, that you read just on a constant basis, like that's the book. Great choice.
Yeah, it's the Proverbs of relationships.
For sure. So tell us, Chris, tell us a little bit about how people can learn more about you, learn more about your work. I know that you've authored, over a dozen books now. Just give us a sense of where people can get to know you a little bit and benefit from some of your insights.
Yeah, just Google The Warrior Maker. That was the moniker that was given to me, decades ago by the clients that I served worldwide. If you Google Chris Harris, I'll be on page 30, maybe. There's like 300 famous Chris Harrises, and I'm not one of them. But if you Google The Warrior Maker, I pretty much own that space. My website's thewarriormaker.com. But that's about it. Just Google The Warrior Maker, and you'll find anything if you're looking for it.
Well, Chris, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and sharing your insights. This has been a lot of really great stuff. I've benefited from a lot of what you've said, and can't wait to go put it to work. Thanks so much for being part of the Negotiation Made Simple podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Coming out of this conversation with Chris Harris, I've got two things in my mind that are really new concepts for me that I'm excited to think more about. One is this whole idea of relative superiority and how it is that you achieve relative superiority through shared purpose. I love the story that Chris shared about Admiral McCraven and how that was his essence and how he helped people achieve incredible things as far as the Navy SEALs goes, and how through mindset and managing our mindset, we can achieve the same thing in the work and the negotiations that we do as well. I also am really intrigued by what he said about metacognition and how we use this idea of thinking about what we are thinking to better manage our fears and how it is that we stay calm and in control when the other side is trying to rattle us. That's only a few of the many things as part of this episode that I think are just great insights for negotiators and can help us achieve what we're looking to get out of our negotiations and our efforts to try to win the next deal. Thanks for listening to the Negotiation Made Simple podcast, and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.